Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now in 2017 the RX 560 was a very welcome release for those on a tight budget, myself included. With a higher core count and a similar price tag as the 460 that came before it, the 560 brought new competition to the Nvidia GTX 1050 that had proven itself as a solid go-to option the previous year. Suddenly, a new battle was taking place at the $100 price point, but despite its lesser amount of VRAM, the 1050 was still able to trade blows with the 4GB version of AMD's new offering. There was a small price difference between the 2GB and 4GB versions of the 560 here in the UK, and back in 2017, the 2GB card was just as easy to recommend. After all, no one needed a whopping 4 gigs at this price point, right? Well, Doom 2016 would like a word. Anyone who spent the extra probably found themselves getting a bit more life out of their 560, and this tiny MSI low profile version is no exception to that assumption. I remember looking for one of these for ages back in 2017, and it turns out it only took nearly 5 years to get my hands on one. Safe to say it was worth the wait because this offers surprising performance even in 2022. It's not a miracle worker by any means, but it can certainly put up a decent fight. I paid £115, which is probably what it cost at launch, but that's a given considering the current market. So let me show you what it can do. Battlefield 2042 is best played with dynamic resolution enabled. The game is set to 1080p with the low settings, and while selecting a lower native res also helps with improving the frame rate, using a dynamic adjustment instead ensures that the game isn't always running at a lower res. It changes based on what's going on the screen, but it never drops to a point where you think, what on earth is going on here? Or what am I even looking at? You can expect around 35 to 40 FPS with native 1080p, but I always find that aiming for 60 FPS is preferable with first-person shooters. I apologise if you can hear the card in the background. It's quite noisy, even at idle. The lowest you can set the fan speed to is 25% in MSI Afterburner, but it doesn't stop spinning at lower loads or temperatures, which is common with small form factor GPUs. I have mine running in an open test bench, so it's probably a bit more audible than it would be inside a case either on or under your desk. So far though, so good, and it's the implementation of techniques such as dynamic scaling and FSR that really helps a card like this out in 2022. Cyberpunk 2077 will run at around 30 FPS with native 1080p, but the game will dip below that quite a bit, especially in busier areas. It makes more sense to enable FSR, which was added in the 1.5 update. We don't need to do anything too drastic here, as the quality option will do. The visual presentation is a bit softer overall, but the gameplay experience is more satisfying than dipping below 30 all the time. Again, I was quite surprised by this result, and I'd certainly suggest looking for a 4GB version of this card these days. That said, if the 1050 Ti doesn't cost much more where you live, then that might make a bit more sense, as I seem to recall it performing a bit better than this years ago, but I can't speak for how they compare these days, not at least until I find another 1050 Ti anyway. That said, the 560 does pretty well in its own right, and for those that don't want to use FSR, you could get a similar performance experience at 900p. In Far Cry 6, FSR comes in handy once again, though using balanced, which would mean a closer to 60 FPS average, doesn't look too great with this game. I find that everything sort of has a flickering edge to it. I'm not certain this can't be resolved with a single setting somewhere, but using the quality FSR preset is easier on the eye, and we're not too far off 60 frames per second. It's actually achievable in more open areas. Again, I'm glad for the 4 gigs of VRAM here, as I'm not sure the 2GB variant would hold up so well here and in any of today's tested games. We're pretty much maxing out the VRAM as it is, and choosing anything other than the low settings gives us a low memory warning. Fortnite doesn't have FSR support, not at the time of this video anyway, but it runs just fine at medium with native 1080p. There are a few minor dips and drops and a couple of frame time issues here and there, but for the most part, things run quite smoothly at just under 80 FPS. The low settings or the performance mode could be used if you want a closer to 120 FPS experience, but I think 60 plus is more of a realistic target for this aging budget offering. If I had paid $100 or pounds or euros etc. back in 2017, I'd still be pretty happy with my investment. GTA? ran fine back in 2017 and it still runs fine now. High settings with the sliders set to max yields a 75 FPS average with respectable percentile figures to go along with it. I had to double check that I didn't leave VSync enabled as my monitor is 75Hz. It was just a coincidence, but it did make me wonder for a second there. At the time of this video, the card is still supported as well, just like its competitor, the 1050, so we do get the latest drivers, plus we get AMD Relive, so capturing gameplay with this card internally can be done by pressing just a couple of hotkeys, and there's actually very little in terms of performance loss when doing so. This gameplay was actually recorded as a test of that at 50 megabits per second with 1080p resolution. The most demanding of today's games is probably Halo Infinite. This also supports dynamic res, and I set this up to target a minimum of 60 FPS, which we weren't quite able to get. The native quality could have been reduced, but again, averaging 60 really wasn't that doable no matter the setting. That didn't stop me from being able to wipe out a few enemy players during my big team battle test, but it's worth bearing in mind that this is very much a 30 FPS plus card in a lot of situations, even if it is capable of 60 in some newer games. In Red Dead Redemption 2, I went with Digital Foundry's Xbox One X equivalent settings, albeit instead of 4K, we are of course using 1080p, but even so, the game looks fantastic and it runs with over 30 frames per second. I can happily play this at 30 FPS after playing it on console for so long, and unless you want to change the resolution to 720p, 60 FPS isn't going to be that realistic. Again, how you play though is totally personal preference, but I always try to talk about and demonstrate the settings that I'd personally use for each game. Red Dead 2 is going to hold up for a while, I reckon, as one of the best looking games out there, and the 4GB 560 might just hold up as one of the best budget graphics cards ever released. I feel the same way about this card as I do about the 750 Ti. It did a lot for gamers on a tighter budget back in the day. We'll end on an older game now, which is the Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Medium graphical settings and the medium post-processing settings didn't actually yield as much of a performance metric as I thought it would in terms of an average, but it still held up pretty well. Lowering a few settings would certainly help, but there are still plenty of instances whereby the game hits 60, sometimes 70 frames per second or more. Overall, the RX 560 is a card that doesn't seem to get as much recognition as its Nvidia counterparts, especially when thinking back to that sort of golden age of budget PC gaming. The thing is, it certainly deserves to be remembered because even today it can offer acceptable frame rates in modern games, though the implementation of dynamic resolution and FSR has certainly helped extend its longevity. And as for the 2GB version of the card, well, I'm not sure how it would compare performance-wise, but I don't think it would hold up as well, considering that a lot of modern games would quickly eat up that 2GB, even with heavily reduced settings. That's all for this one then. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like on it down below. Leave a dislike if you didn't. Let me know what you think of the RX 560 and whether or not you still use one in your system on a daily basis. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.